something to make sure my legs were working so it could come up here.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. Ben, is that the sheet? Yes, I do need that. Okay, here's what this is all supposed to be all about. It says, at this time, 45 years ago, and it was exactly 45 years ago plus 3 weeks, the UMJC was founded. Too often there has been significant misunderstanding and ignorance regarding the founding of the UMJC, the union's early days, and its relationship to other organizations, such as the MJAA. Utilizing and building on the historical documents, as well as a first-hand eyewitness experience, this session will lay out and fill in the missing or misunderstood details of when, why, and how the union came into existence. As Ben sort of intimated, I was actually in the room where it happened. I got to see and to hear and to participate in the various elements that were involved in the founding of the UMJC and its prehistory as well. Now, what I want to be able to do is not sing to you, because you don't want that, but I want to be able to put you into the room where it happened as well. And the way I can do that is I will actually share it with you. I will read from the historical documents that are associated with these amazing events. So you'll have to forgive me for doing a lot of reading, but I want to make sure that you know what happened, and it's not just, oh, that guy said so-and-so. Fair enough? All right, then if you'll change the slide, please. I want to start with the historical context. And as part of the historical context, I want to look at the atmosphere within the MJAA, the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. So I'm going to read for you first from the minutes of the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, the Executive Committee, March 6, 1976. I did bring the documents along with me. So, this time was referencing a discussion that took place in the Executive Committee. The general discussion in the minutes is related to the proposed membership of Messianic organizations and congregations in the MJAA. And the minutes read, the general discussion felt that the need was there for a congregational association, but that it should be separate from the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. End quote. Thank you for the comment, because not everyone is aware of that. And that becomes significant to understand as you reflect on the early history of the union and the relationship that existed between the two organizations. You see, this was an important part of the circumstances that led to the formation of any kind of association of Messianic congregations. And as we look at the setting, we'll see some of the people who were involved. The minutes read, President Joe Fischer. Oh, I'm not going to apologize for sharing with you specific names for two reasons. Number one, because these were the people who were there, and number two, because we need to know these people. We need to give the people proper credit for their involvement in what took place. Fair enough? Some of the names may be familiar, some may not, but they should be familiar because of what they contributed. Okay, MJAA Executive Meeting. President Joseph Finkelstein, President. Al Adler, Vice President. Sid Roth, Recording Secretary. Martin Seuss, Treasurer. Manny Rodman, Martin Chernoff, Joel Chernoff, Jerome Fleischer, Arthur Glass, Rockwell Friedman, Paul Lieberman, Larry Rich, General Secretary. So, at least as far back as the mid-70s then, the need for this kind of union was clearly recognized by important Messianic Jewish leaders. The next thing I wanted to share with you, as part of the atmosphere of the Messianic Jewish Alliance, is what I've described, as you see it here, the formation of the UMJS and aftermath. Gang, that's not a typo. I'm talking about the formation of the UMJS. I want to share with you some of the minutes of the Union of Messianic Jewish Synagogues. You see, gang, there was a predecessor to the union. Now, this comes from its meeting July 2nd, 1976. Here's what happened. Despite the stories that some people may have heard or that you may, in fact, read about, what I just read to you about in the minutes of the 76th meeting, executive meeting of the MJAA, produced continued discussion over the next several months. And after that, at the Messiah 76 conference in July, that discussion continued even further. So a number of people gathered there to discuss the need for an association of congregations in more detail. In fact, there was a discussion of the possibility of setting aside some time at Messiah 76. For those of you who are not familiar with the MJAA, they have had a Messiah conference now for a long time. I won't even try to figure out for how long a time they've had it. But anyhow, so this is Messiah 76. And anyhow, what I was saying is there was a discussion of the possibility of setting aside some time at Messiah 76 in order to form an organization of Messianic congregations. Now, in a second, I'm going to read to you a list of some of the names involved in that very meeting at Messiah 76 to do just that, to form an organization. Not going to read to you all of the names. I'm just going to read to you some of them. Some of the people that were involved in the original meeting or discussion were Manny Brockman, Jeff Adler, David Stern, John Fischer. I mean, you don't know who that John Fischer guy is. But anyhow, Joe Rosenfarb, Sid Roth, Paul Lieberman, Shira Lindsay, who became Shira Lindsay Sokoran, Ray Gannon, Mal Jacobs, who we mentioned earlier, and two people by the name of Chernoff, Martin and David. Now, I found it is interesting in looking at the minutes of that meeting that Manny Brockman opened the meeting by suggesting we start by singing Hine Matov. Good move, Manny. There was an extensive discussion of the meaning of such a congregational organization, even its framework. In other words, what the framework of such an organization might involve. And then after looking at some proposed bylaws and then tentatively approving them, there was an election of officers. By the way, the name that was most agreed on was the Union of Messianic Jewish Synagogues, the name for this organization. Now that was after much discussion about whether the name should include synagogues or congregations. And so the UMJC was then launched. There were a number of people who were elected, and these are the people who were elected as officers of the UMJS. President, Manny Brockman. Vice President, the strange guy, John Fischer. Treasurer, Paul Lieberman. Secretary, Dr. James Hutchins. And in addition, there was agreed to something called the 13 Articles of Messianic Jewish Faith. Now, many of you will probably understand the significance of that particular title and discussion. As the interim president of this new organization, Manny Brockman said something interesting to us, and it was recorded in the minutes. Manny said that what was now needed for the congregations was, to use his words, a loose union. But then I like the next phrase that he uses and are mentioned in the minutes. It was to be a love union, one which would likewise demonstrate unity among the congregations. And I think that those of us who were there certainly integrated that into our own thinking, and hopefully we carried it along into the future. So now we were off to a wonderful start. There were a number of congregations representatives there. According to the minutes, there were 17, and we were all excited. And when we realized, and then we realized we hadn't really been delegated by our own synagogues and congregations to represent them as we should. This has sort of happened spontaneously, as we should have been officially delegated for such an event. So we thought it would be wise then to go back and check with our various congregational leaderships and our congregational memberships to see what they thought about this idea. So then, in a sense, what has happened is we took a step back. So we met then the next year, this time more officially delegated. Now, I'm going to read to you from the minutes of the June 30th, 1977 meeting. Oh, by the way, where did this meeting take place? At the Messiah Conference and on the conference grounds. So, anyhow, I'm now reading from the minutes. We were meeting, the minutes say. We were meeting because of the success of the panel discussion on Messianic congregations held earlier in the week. So the minutes read. And that, of course, then, not unsurprisingly, or not surprisingly, that, of course, refueled or reignited then the effort to get together and discuss this whole issue of a congregational association a little further. And perhaps then, after having taken a step back, we could then take another step forward. And during that second formation meeting, and again, this becomes significant to the early history of the serenity and tranquility that existed between the Union and the Alliance. At that at that second formation meeting, Manny made the motion to select a specific congregation at which to meet for a weekend for this very reason, to proceed with putting together the Association of Congregations. And this was probably a very wise move. And both Joe Finkelstein and I urged that we should do exactly that. By the way, Joe Finkelstein, you've heard his name already before, was a very significant leader in the MJAA. And so Joe was asked to head up that effort, and he accepted that role. Further, as the minutes note, it was moved that Joe scheduled that meeting by the end of March 1978. This was to be the meeting to put together the organization. And it was decided to give Joe the flexibility so that he would have the leeway to get the work done, to do whatever he had to do, so that the meeting would take place by March of 1978. This would then give all of us a couple months to go back to our congregations and come back together again in July 79 at the Messiah Conference to form this association. And it's interesting that at that point, Manny moved as follows, quote, I move that for the purpose of eligibility at the March meeting, that we recognized a congregation that, 1, had at least 10 Messianic Jews, and 2, that said congregation had been in existence for at least 3 months, meeting at least weekly, and 3, be entitled to 2 votes per congregation, end quote. Now, for some of you, that's going to sound familiar, especially if you had to look at our governing documents. And so, in July 1977, we left Messiah College in anticipation of having the March 1978 formation meeting. And Joe, being faithful to his responsibilities and to his role, sent out a letter to us in which he spelled out some of the groundwork for that very meeting. The letter. The very meeting we mentioned. I'm now reading from Joe's letter. Enclosed, you will find the minutes from last year's meeting, this is fall 1977, along with the 13 articles of faith, as well as the proposed bylaws. With regard to operating committees needed prior to the meeting, I'm proposing the following committees. So says the minutes, or his letter. And so we propose the following committees, none of which will sound at all familiar to anybody here. These included a worship committee, a music committee, an education committee, a bylaws and constitution committee, and then a clearinghouse or communications committee. So So reads his letter. And so was launched then the hoped-for beginning of what today we call, for what today we call the Union of Messianic Jewish Synagogues, a second time. And we were about as effective the second time as we were the first time. Now, part of the reason for that, in all honesty or transparency, was that somewhere along the line between that letter and March 1978, Joe Finkelstein said he no longer wanted to remain involved. And that left us pretty much without an organization. But nevertheless, still sensing very much the need for such an organization or association that was decided at both of the meetings, first of all at Messiah 76 and then at Messiah 77. That was the atmosphere that existed in the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America at that time. Next slide, please. Now, with that having taken place, and being that the organization that was founded and unfounded remained unfounded, there were some relevant things going on in Chicago. At that time, Chicago had two Messianic synagogues, Adat HaTikva and Congregation B'nai Maccabee. And somewhere in this conference, there is someone from Congregation B'nai Maccabee. The leader is somewhere here. I don't know if he's actually in the room or not. But anyhow, we were getting together on a regular basis. I'll give you the setting for that in a moment. But before I read from the letter that describes those ongoing conversations, I want to read another letter, July 4th, 1987. This letter was part of our legal and historical documents. It summarizes how far we were at that point in time, and here's how it reads.
What was the date? What was the date? 87 or 78?
This was 87. This was reflecting back on our, but it was registered as part of our historical documents. Okay. The letter reads, at Messiah 76 and Messiah 77, there were exploratory meetings held to discuss the possibility of forming an organization of congregations. These meetings were independent of the MJAA, although many alliance leaders were present. The organization of congregations was tentatively set up, in which Manny Button was elected president and John Fischer as vice president. However, some of the congregational representatives felt uncomfortable with the structure, and at the 1977 meeting, decided to have further discussion on the matter. Joe Finkelstein was asked to coordinate the continuing discussion and exploration, and he agreed to spearhead that effort. Everyone at the 1977 meeting was favorably disposed to the concept, but wanted more time to consider it. It should be pointed out that Martin Chernoff left the 1976 meeting and indicated he could not take part at that time, but specified that he had no animosity toward anyone, and that he might join in the future. He was unable to attend the 1977 meeting due to a virus. The concept of the organization was that it would be a loose confederation of congregations, separate from the MJA, but in cooperation with it, which was the desire of the MJAA Executive Committee at that time. After a year or so, Joe Finkelstein asked to be relieved of his responsibilities. So reads the letter. Now, the reason I'm reading this is so that you get all of the relevant details. Back to the letter. He suggested that John Fischer should be spearheading the effort instead of him. John, in turn, suggested to Dan Juster that he oversee the efforts. And I thought I saw Dan's son, Ben, or something. Yeah, there he is. Dan's not here, but he sent Ben to represent. Okay, anyhow, to continue. John suggested to Dan Juster that he oversee the efforts. Dan declined. A little later, the letter goes on to say, both John and Dan felt that if an alliance of congregations were to form, it should be more of a grassroots movement, and that they should not be the ones to bring it about or to promote it. Now, let me break into the letter. This is very interesting. in view of some of the alleged history of the beginning and the formation of the union, and exactly who was involved and how. This leads into the next part, back to the letter. About this time, the liaison committee, composed of leaders from Adat HaTikva and Congregation B'nai Maccabim, was meeting regularly and discussing cooperative efforts. It was felt that if a union of congregations were to form, that it would come from a committee such as this. And although John was on the committee, it would not be at his request or prompting. This, in fact, was the case. Now, that was some of the wisdom that Dan and I had discussed as we both politely declined to have anything to do with the actual suggestion of the forming of such an association. Now, the letter continues to describe what was going on in Chicago at this time, and that provides us with some of the important setting. The letter says, during this time, the elders of Adat HaTikva and the elders of Congregation B'nai Maccabim sought closer relations. In order to facilitate that, a committee was formed consisting of leaders from both congregations. The following individuals were on that committee: John Fischer and Mike Becker from Congregation B'nai Maccabim, and Larry Rich, Ron Pfeffer, Elliot Freeman, and Bert Horowitz from Adat HaTikva. Unfortunately, both Larry Rich and Elliot Freeman had it in the next number of years, as well as Michael Becker actually, have passed away. Now, Dan had left Chicago by this time, and so he was safely ensconced in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Back to the letter. The Adat HaTikva and Congregation B'nai Maccabim Liaison Committee explored the possibility of a joint high holiday worship service, Passover dinners, outreach functions, and even merging into one congregation. The Liaison Committee had regular meetings through 1978 and most of 1979. And if I think about it, I can even still now picture the restaurant where we met. I don't remember the name, but I can picture the inside of that restaurant. Well, anyhow, back to the letter. As a result of these committee meetings, Adat HaTikva and Congregation B'nai Maccabim participated in many activities together. And there's one I will remember forever, and this room helps me remember it, because we had a joint Sukkot service. We built a nice sukkah outdoors, and then we had a joint service. Now, this was Chicago. That year, Sukkot happened at the end of October. I remember it for a couple of reasons. My wife, Dr. Patrice, was the speaker at that meeting. And, with all due respect to her, all of us froze. We decided not to do that again. Anyhow. So, but again, this room reminds me of just that experience. Okay, back to the letter. Their leaders learned several things. Whereas there were divisions and congregational splits in other regions, and Messianic leaders who didn't even talk to each other. And of course, that was unique just to that. Well, anyhow, two congregations found a healthy means to achieve agreement and unity. It wasn't that there was agreement on all matters. It was felt that the leaders of the two congregations found a structure that increased communication and interaction. Agreement and unity was simply the natural byproduct. It was postulated that if the two congregations could do this on a local level, then all the Messianic congregations could do it on a national level. Discussions then took place on a merger through the liaison committee. The primary concern that divided the congregations in the eyes of Congregation B'nai Maccabim's leadership was Adat HaTikva's connection to the Presbyterian denomination. It was felt that this relationship could be detrimental to our standing in the Jewish community. Let me pause. To some degree, if you paid attention to Dr. Yaakov Ariel yesterday in this very room, it was justifiable. He reflected on some of those kinds of issues. Anyway, back to the letter. The leaders from Adat HaTikva had considered the congregation independent of the presbytery previously, but still desired some structure of congregational accountability for themselves. But both congregations favored an organization which might appear less Gentile to the Jewish community, and one that we could all agree with doctrinally. It was at that moment that Mike brought up the idea of trying to form a union of Messianic congregations ourselves. In other words, with all due respect to Mike, who's now smiling down on us, this is all Mike Becker's fault. And he's not even here to take the blame. Okay, we continue with the letter. Discussion of the formation of a union of congregations, therefore, was a natural outgrowth of the desire for autonomy and accountability of congregations, desiring a Messianic polity, and I might add, and identity. The liaison committee discussed other reasons for an alliance of congregations. The Messianic movement was rapidly growing, and congregations were scattered all over the country and were isolated. It was felt that Messianic congregations needed to band together in order to have a sense of being part of a bigger picture. The MJAA provided that aspect for individuals, but not for congregations. Also, there was a need to mutually edify and support one another on a congregational level, and to share each other's resources so that we're not duplicating our individual efforts. The liaison committee did not feel that they had the authority to decide to form a union. It was felt that if an alliance of congregations was to form at all, it would be by an overwhelming voice of duly authorized representatives of the known Messianic congregations. A simple majority could not do it. The reason for forming a union needed to be sorted out and identified. John Fischer and Ron Pfeffer, Ron is, to my knowledge, still alive and kicking.
Yes.
It is real. I visited him a number of years, in Marley a number of years ago. Anyhow, they identified John Fischer and Ron Pfeffer, therefore were appointed to plan the initial meeting of Messianic congregations so that these objectives could be met. It was learned later that Norton Chernoff, along with 2 other leaders, refused the invitation and would not come. This was quite disappointing, but the committee respected their decision. 12 of 15 congregations, however, were represented. So the letter goes. Now, and that document of proposed formation was countersigned by all those who were present at the liaison committee meeting. They became known as the Chicago Six. They included Larry Rich, Elliot Freeman, Bert Horowitz,
Ron
Ron Pfeffer, thank you. Ron Pfeffer, Michael Becker, and John Fischer. And so it began. Following our instructions, Ron and I issued a letter calling a meeting in Chicago. And in that letter, we suggested the following. Said letter. About a year ago, spurred by efforts of the Executive Committee of the Messianic Jewish Alliance of Chicago, okay, at that time, the MJAA had local, branches, groups, whatever. So, spurred by the efforts of the Executive Committee of the Messianic Jewish Alliance of Chicago, a liaison committee made up of representatives from the 2 Messianic Jewish synagogues in Chicago was formed. The purpose of the committee was to foster communication between and cooperative efforts by the 2 congregations. One of the topics discussed and prayed over during these committee meetings was the pressing need for a national association of Messianic congregations, which would accomplish some of the things on a national scale, which the committee was doing on a local level. One representative from each congregation volunteered to meet to get the ball rolling, and with the Spirit's prodding, the attempt began. We are suggesting that a conference of representatives of the Messianic congregations be held in the spring for the following purposes. Define the potential functions and benefits of such an association. Pinpoint obstacles. Consider the nature of such an association and examine various alternate structures. organize working committees in relative areas, and establish a plan for implementing a first step. We propose April 20th to April 22nd as a date for such a conclave. This would offer the opportunity for further action and activity before this summer and deciding 1979. Chicago seems to be an advantageous location because of its centrality and accessibility. And so the letter reads. And so we sent off the letter and we had a meeting. We had discussions on a Friday. Then on Friday evening, we met for services at Congregation B'nai Maccabee. Saturday morning, we had services at Adopted Tikva. Then on Saturday afternoon, we continued the discussion. Now, we had intended to wrap all this up on Sunday morning, but in good union fashion, we weren't done by then. So we reconvened in the basement of Larry Rich's home. And so we still went on. Still more discussion. Now, in addition to those who were the original perpetrators of this discussion, the aforementioned Chicago Six, of those who sat around in Larry Rich's basement in Skokie, there are only, to my knowledge, 3 others of the official delegates who were there in that basement who are still connected to the union. One is, of course, Stan, represented by Ben. One is the guy who remains so regularly behind the scenes for us, Walter Lee. And the other is Marcy Cotton, who we will actually hear at the services tomorrow morning. From time to time, when I reflected on those basement meetings in Larry Rich's home on that Sunday afternoon, I realized that we did accomplish what we set out to accomplish. This now is the letter we sent out in follow-up to our Chicago formation meetings. Quoting the letter. This correspondence is in follow-up to the meeting held in Chicago to pursue the forming of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. By the way, we had decided on that as a name. It distinguished us from the Union of Messianic Jewish Synagogues, which we had buried. The letter continues. Some 19 congregations, of which only 12 could be in attendance, agreed to the desirability to forming such a loose affiliation for purposes of mutual help, discussion, and sharing of materials. This meeting, held from April 20th to 22nd, resulted in a determination to incorporate a religious corporation and to adopt a set of bylaws under which such an organization would operate. And then a little later, the letter continues. Although this organization is in no way connected with the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, that organization's executive committee has said it would look with favor on the forming of a union of congregations. Messiah 79, the conference of the MJAA and YMJAA, by virtue of its broad attendance, seems to be a good occasion for the UMJC to hold its meetings during the conference's off hours. And so reads the letter. Now, I need to remind you that one of the people who was involved in this project was Larry Rich, who was the General Secretary of the MJAA at that time. And when I read from some more documents, they will also highlight that there were further connections between the MJAA and the people involved in the union formation. So that was the Chicago meeting that I listed as the Chicago conclave. Look at the next one. I thought I had Chicago, but I'm sorry, it's somewhere up there.
C1, right up.
Oh, there it is. See, I'm working with my reading glasses instead of now I can read it. All right. Now, as part of that conference or conclave, we worked on bylaws, but we also worked on some standards. And I have my own copy, which has all kinds of interesting corrections and additions. If somebody close up can see scrawling as part of their written into their standards. These were now the standards for Messianic Jewish congregations. Later, I'm going to reflect on some of our theological, philosophical, and perhaps anthropological or sociological standards. but here they are, our standards. Quote, all congregations in membership in the UMJC shall commit themselves to the following standards. The Bible is their absolute authority in all matters of religion and practice. Salvation is by grace through faith in Yeshua's atonement and resurrection. He is Messiah and Lord. As Jewish followers of Yeshua, we are called to maintain our Jewish biblical heritage and remain a part of our people Israel, as well as the universal body of believers. That's a little like bilateralism, you know. Anyhow, and actually, it sounds like some of the things that Dr. Ariel shared with us yesterday as well. Back to the letter. This is part of our identity. Back to the standards. This is part of our identity as the witness to the faithfulness of God. As believers in the Scriptures, we subscribe to the divinity of Yeshua. End quote. That's it. Those were our doctrinal standards. And there were reasons for those particular standards, which I will get into shortly. So, the birthing of the UMJC. We met at the Messiah Conference in 1979. At that time, there were on the executive committee of the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America a number of people who were very favorably disposed towards the formation of the union. They included, and again, these were the people on the executive committee of the MJAA: Moshe Rosen, Larry Rich, Rockwell Friedland, Daniel Juster, Paul Lieberman, Sid Roth, John Fischer, and Luther Fleischer. That's who went to that conference. The notes from July of 1987 go on to say, and I quote, unfortunately, the new MJAA board majority elected at the 1979 Messiah Conference was not favorably disposed toward the union. An executive meeting was convened right after the elections were held, and now the union was told we would no longer be permitted to be among the Messiah College candidates. And Stone said, we met at the Holiday Inn Hotel, June 27, 1979. And now for the minutes of our first official UMJC meeting.
John, that was in Mechanicsburg.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the Holiday Inn. It's good.
Holiday Inn in Mechanicsburg.
Yeah, I didn't mention where it was, but Jeff, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to know it's on campus.
Yes, thank you. Important. Yes, it was off campus. All right, the minutes. The purposes and desires of the UMJC are not to be an association to control. We're here to develop a structured organization for aiding, encouraging, fellowshipping, the training of one another, identification and protection of Messianic Judaism. The basis of the UMJC should be trust, love, prayer. Again, there were some officers who were elected. Dan Juster, President; John Fischer, Vice President; Les Jacobs, Secretary; Jeff Adler, Treasurer. Okay. There's a couple of people I'm leaving out that I should mention, who were there at that particular organizational meeting. The late Barry Rudolph was involved. Sitting very prominently in the front row, L.A. McClain was involved. And there were several others. So, there you have it. There was another interesting part of the background to this whole launching into Messianic Jewish space. At that particular Messiah 79 conference, I had been asked to teach a section regarding the meaning and importance of the Jewish traditions for the Messianic Jewish lifestyle. And as a result of that particular session, the very next morning, at that Messiah 79 conference, and some of you will really appreciate this, we had over 50 people meeting for Shacharit. That's just to give you a feel for the atmosphere at that particular time. Now, as a union newly formed, we set up meetings. We were going to meet twice a year. Delegates meetings in the spring and a general conference in October. Now, I just want to briefly revisit something because It leads to where we are presently. I'm reading now from the minutes of the very first delegates meeting, April 11th through 13th, 1980. These were some of the things to which we agreed. To put love and service ahead of everything. To develop relationships of trust. To have prayer at the forefront, and that in turn was spelled out. To have a spirit of grace, have a spirit of concern, and do all in unity and in love. And then in a follow-up letter to our formation in June 1979, was sent out, this letter was sent out to our newly elected president. And the letter was sent out on August 10th, 1979. Here's the letter. It reads, first on the agenda is to get to know one another better, to love, support, and to trust. And that was foundational. And that part remains the same. Now, next slide, please. The theological climate. First, a questioning of Messianic Judaism among evangelicals. What I want to do is say something briefly, because I don't have a whole lot of time at this particular point. It's about the theological climate at that time. I do this because it sets the stage for why we put together some of the things that we did. The theological climate was, first of all, very seriously questioning Messianic Judaism. The MJAA had responded to this questioning by putting together a statement of faith sometime before the founding of the Union. I don't have a record of that statement of faith, but it was an attempt to allay the fears of the Christian world as to who we were, in an effort to show that we were really kosher. Thank you. There was a very interesting response to that that MJAA statement of faith. At that time, I was teaching at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. It was a time when we were, it was a time when there were on that campus some very wonderful people who were teaching. Those of you who are familiar with the literature of the academic world and of biblical studies might recognize people such as Richard Longenecker, Walter Kaiser, Gleason Archer, and Kenneth Conser, who was also the editor of Christianity Today at the time. It was a very pro-messianic atmosphere at the seminary. However, having read the statement that came out of the MJAA, it was decimated by those friendly scholars because the statement was not well put together. That statement was pulled apart by the people of Trinity, the people who were favorably inclined towards us. Now, that was the atmosphere in which we were operating. Around that same time also, and this was shortly before the foundation of the Union, an important meeting took place. One other person from Trinity, quite well known at that time, Herbert King, and then Arthur Glasser from Fuller Seminary, put together what you would call it, a confab in Chicago, where some of us involved in the Messianic movement met with people from the mission world of evangelical Christianity to make sure that everyone was basically on the same page theologically and understood where we in Messianic Judaism were coming from. It was an interesting discussion. I think the year was 1977. Arthur Glasser and Herb King were some of the big names in the missionary world. Some other people who were there included David Stern, Arnold Falkenbaum, who is in the room next door right now, and also Harold Sever. So that was before the forming of the Union, and we had an interesting discussion at those meetings. So what I've done here, I've gone further back in time to give you a feel for the theological climate of those days. So that provides then some of the setting that launched our own set of standards. So, next one. There we go. Formulating the UMJC standards. Concerning the UMJC standards, and this now comes from the letter of August 10th, 1979 that Dan wrote to us, following up our formation meeting. One of the motivations for us was, to put it in there, we've got to distinguish ourselves from the cults. Okay? So we consciously chose at that time, in a sense, to pattern our standards after an organization that had a great deal of respect at that time. The National Association of Angels. And we used their basic framework of theological standards for our own. You can understand, given the background I just sketched, why we chose to do it that way. Then there was assigned to the union's very first theology committee a further assignment with respect to those standards. I'm going to read that letter that was sent to the original theology committee, May 22nd, 1980. As you're undoubtedly aware, the work of the theology committee of the UMJC is most strategic and important. We have a vital task before us. When the very basic 4-point standards were adopted as part of the bylaws of the UMJC, it was left to the theology committee to sharpen, add, delete, refine, etc. these statements. Items such as conversion of Gentiles to Judaism were also tabled in the same way. By the way, this shows that we were having the same kind of discussions back then. Back to the letter. In addition to the above, Dan Juster, our president, has suggested that each member of the committee prepare papers and/or brief answers to the following. 1. Can a non-Jew become a Jew? And if so, how? 2. Should UMJC recognize ordination? 3. What is the relationship of grace to law? And therefore, what should be our position on Jewish practice and lifestyle? 4. What is the position, place, and future of non-Jews in a Messianic congregation? So it reads. Of course, none of those issues are still around today. So those were the 4 questions to which each committee member would submit in writing their positions, and then the letter was signed by John Fischer, Theology Committee Chair. So that's how we launch with respect to the standards. Let's flip to the next slide. Okay. This is here, as it says, for bibliographic purposes. This is perhaps the standard for these early days of the Messianic movement. David Rausch is an important American religious historian, and his book, Messianic Judaism, Its History, Theology, and Polity, are absolutely essential to understanding this time period. Unfortunately, it's out of print, and the latest prices I've heard for it, I think, run into 3 figures. But anyhow, you can get a hold of a copy.
I have a copy of that.
All the options.
Okay. Now, I've added one final item to my discussion, and that is the intention of the founders. The intention of the founders was how to achieve and arrive at tranquility and serenity. Unfortunately, you don't find that place on just any map. Because we very consciously chose to be a broad umbrella. Sometimes we call it a big tent, sometimes we call it a large patchwork. Because of that, what we had set in motion, the basis for what we deem our history, is being as inclusive as possible. Hence, just the 4 theological points that we started with. So from the onset, we committed ourselves to unity and diversity. I'll say it again, to unity and diversity. We understood it in Chicago, and we should understand it as well now, let me suggest. Throughout the country at that time, and still today, there were people who felt called to purge us, and there were others who felt called to carve us into their own image. Unfortunately for them, but fortunately for us, neither has thus far been successful. And my prayer is that success, or rather the lack of it, will continue. We have a tendency, let me suggest, We've had a tendency too often, my friends, and this is gonna get a little personal, to operate with perceptions. Let me suggest where perceptions lead. Perceptions lead first of all to suspicion. They will also lead to accusation and ultimately to marginalization. What I want to do now as I close is to suggest a different model to operate from. And that's not perception, but communication and decision. Communication is the Matthew 18 principle. If you have something against someone, or if someone else has something against you, you go to that person and you talk to them. You do not assume that you've correctly perceived where that person is coming from. Number 2, decision. Decisions don't just happen. We choose to do them. We decide. We make a decision to commit to relationships with one another. That's what this whole union business was all about. We decide, we choose, and we choose cooperation rather than conflict. And then finally, and this is the one that most people probably pay the least attention to, you choose to trust. Now, years ago, Ron Aronson, who has since passed away, referred to his good friend Paul Saul, and he said basically this: Paul and I disagree on an awful lot of things, but I love Paul, and Paul loves me, and we'll always be friends, and nothing will change that. Well said, Ron. That's the commitment when you choose relationships, cooperation, and trust. Then we won't have to look back and say, we buried another organization. Okay. If you have to leave or you have children to pick up, feel free to do that. Since we have until 2 o'clock before the next meeting, I'm willing to hang around for any questions that you might have.